All right, so hopping back into these notes, like I said earlier this semester, anything psychological is probably going to be a mix of both nature and nurture influences. So we can describe this with the diathesis stress model. This term is not in your textbook, so it's really important that you know what it is because I've seen it on multiple AP exams. So the diathesis stress model basically says that your behaviors are a result of both biological factors and also your life experiences. And it's the interaction of those two things that makes you who you are. So interaction is the effect of one factor depending on another. So the idea here with the diathesis stress model is that you are born into this world with your nature influences kind of already set. Like you have your genetic background, you have your DNA, you're a product of not only your like direct familial ancestry, but also the broader ancestry of the human species. And then on top of that, your environment works to further shape who you are. So some people are genetically already predisposed or vulnerable to certain conditions, but those conditions might be then triggered and exacerbated by some kind of external environmental circumstance. So a great example of something that follows the diathesis stress model is schizophrenia. So studies show that if you have a family member, like a mother or father or some other kind of close genetically related family member who suffers from schizophrenia, then you have a 1 in 10 chance of developing schizophrenia, where the general population that does not have any kind of genetic background with schizophrenia has a 1 in 100 chance of developing it. So if you have a family history of it, your chance of developing schizophrenia goes up 10 times. However, that's still 1 in 10. So 9 people of those 10 people do not develop schizophrenia. So what might influence who actually does develop it? Well, it could be your nurture influences. So for some people, schizophrenia is triggered by a stressful or traumatic event. And if they already have the genetic kind of recipe for developing schizophrenia, then that traumatic event can trigger its onset. So you see here nature and nurture both working together. So other examples that follow the diathesis stress model, like obesity would be one where you can be genetically predisposed to obesity, but then something in your environment, whether it is a traumatic experience or maybe it is just the culture you live in, something then triggers or exacerbates the effect of obesity. Heart disease is one, alcoholism is another one. Eating disorders are one as well. You know, you might be genetically predisposed to anxiety or to having an urge to control your environment, and then you also may have some kind of stressful life event, or maybe you are triggered by the media around you and gender roles and things like that to then develop an eating disorder when you're already genetically predisposed to it. Okay, that's the diathesis stress model, nature and nurture working together. Let's move into evolutionary psychology now. So this is the study of how behavior and the mind have evolved. So again, biological psychology is looking more at like how are you a product of your direct and individual biology, or maybe even like how are you a product of your parents' genetic history. When we look at evolutionary psychology, we're looking at the broader human species as a whole. So we're looking at, in general, how are we all alike and how are we all a product of our evolutionary past? And we're really focusing here on natural selection. So natural selection is this idea that traits that enable survival and reproduction are passed on to succeeding generations, while traits that don't enable survival will die out over time. So I think I already told you guys an example of evolutionary psychology when it comes to fear. So some evolutionary psychologists believe that fears or certain fears may be innate, which means inborn within us, like the fear of the dark. So humans who didn't avoid the dark, so maybe like a dark, scary cave, who didn't avoid that, maybe were devoured by something in that cave or got lost in the cave or didn't make it out long enough to reproduce and pass their genes on. So same thing with like the fear of heights. Our ancestors who weren't afraid of heights and then climbed that mountain and never made it down, they didn't live long enough to pass their genes on. We also see in general, though, with natural selection that changes in traits happen over time due to genetic mutations. So if it was something about, this one group of people who are really afraid of the dark, and they happen to just reproduce more than others, then their genetic mutations were passed on to their offspring and then later generations. And just a quick note, I think I already mentioned this too. While the theory of evolution is religiously contested, remember we're operating here within the field of psychology, and basically every scientist will agree with Darwin's general theory of evolution through natural selection because it does form the basis of biology. So that's how we are talking about evolution in the context of psychology. All right, so here's some, I don't think this is on your guided notes. So here are some interesting things about evolutionary theories on sexuality. So, what kind of information can we get from evolutionary psychology in terms of what people think is physically attractive? So do you ever wonder why women may tend to view sexual activity in terms of relationships while men may tend to view sexual activity in terms of recreation? Well, historically, men and women worked together to ensure the survival of most of their offspring. So how did women do that? Well, women had to choose wisely to mate with one or just a few strong, healthy men to make sure that their offspring were then strong enough to survive birth and live past the early years. While men, to ensure the survival of the most offspring, would choose to mate with many women to increase the possibility of healthy children. So while we can see in pop culture, pop culture tells us that, well, women just want relationships and men just want sex. If we look at it from an evolutionary point of view, there could be some kind of evolutionary basis for that pop culture idea. We can also see here that what men and women consider attractive may have some kind of evolutionary history. For example, men, and this is for men and women, this is across cultures. Because a lot of what people think is physically attractive can be culturally bound. But what we're talking about here, this is people of all cultures and all times. So men typically find women who seem to be youthful and have an hourglass figure. That means a waist 1/3 narrower than their hips. They seem to find those women the most attractive. And a reason for this could be because past generations of men looked for healthy women to increase the chance of their offspring's survival. So a woman appears more fertile and can actually survive childbirth better, and their child can survive childbirth better if their waist is 1/3 narrower than their hips. And then women across all cultures tend to think that men who look youthful, healthy, mature, who seem dominant, bold, affluent, which is like wealthy, and even commitment oriented, they look more attractive. And the reason for that might be because past generations of women needed strong, healthy men to support and protect not only themselves, but also their children. So there seems to be some kind of evolutionary theory for why we find certain things attractive. Just an interesting little side note. Okay, so critics of the evolutionary perspective, they say that we are not just solely products of our evolutionary past. Mental processes and behaviors are also influenced by our current culture and our current society. So they would say our culture dictates our choices, not just our evolutionary history. They say that this perspective is putting way too much emphasis on nature and not giving enough credit to our nurture influences. So if we go back to sexuality as an example here, what would critics of the evolutionary perspective say? Well, they would say that men and women have desired different things in each other as culture and society have changed. So for example, Marilyn Monroe was seen as the most beautiful woman. However, if you look at her body frame compared to what's considered attractive today in modern culture, she weighed much more than the women today. So much more curvy shape was considered attractive just 50 years ago. And we also know that culture dictates our mating choices, not just our evolutionary history. So for example, culturally, in Western societies, it's culturally accepted that humans pair off monogamously, while thousands of years ago, you actually had a greater chance of producing more healthy children if men mated with different women. So we can see here that our current culture kind of contradicts our evolutionary history. And that's what critics of the evolutionary perspective would say about that. Okay, so let's move on to our nurture influences here. This is what influences our behaviors and mental processes from our outside world. So if we even start all the way back, when you were in your mother's womb, there are some nurture influences that can, or some environmental influences that can affect you before you're even born. So for example, babies get their nourishment from their mother's placenta, and the placenta can actually transfer harmful agents as well. So that's why women are encouraged not to drink or not to smoke or use drugs or even eat things like deli meat and sushi and stuff like that, because it could transfer harmful agents to the baby. And the reason why this is a nurture influence and not a nature influence is because this is something that the mother is doing in her environment that's apart from her genetic code that is influencing her child. So it has nothing to do with your genetic background. It has everything to do with the environment that the mother is in and the environment that she's kind of creating for the fetus while it's in the womb. We also know this from the Hawk article we read last week, that your experiences actually can reflect on your brain size and your brain complexity. So this goes back to the Rosenwig rat experience, where you had these rats put in different cages with different amounts of stimulation. And you saw that the rats that were in a more stimulating environment, the cage on the right, had more complex neural networks than the brains of the rats that were in the impoverished cage. And you can see there the comparison between the neural networks and the neurons in those two different conditions in the brains of those two different rats. What does this mean for humans? Well, we actually know that babies who are handled, especially if they're premature and underdeveloped, if they're able to be handled, we found that they can actually develop quicker and more effectively with a stimulating environment than babies who are in a non-stimulating or non-handled environment. This also has some implications for this idea of use it or lose it. Stimulation from your environment is essential for proper brain development and even brain maintenance. So it's really important when you are developing as an infant and as a child, and then continuing through your life to maintain your complex neural networks. So if we want to kind of look back at, so what does nature have to do with this then? Well, we can say our genes dictate the overall brain architecture, but our experience directs the details. So our experience directs how complex our brain will become. And then if we also take a second look at parental and peer influences here. So when it comes to like how much influence do your parents in your environment have compared to your peers? What studies show is that your parents, because you are surrounded with them longer in your life, are going to have more of a long-term influence, your parents and your family, while your peers are going to have more of a short-term influence. So you're going to reflect more of what your family life is like. So typically children adopt similar political attitudes, religious attitudes, economic attitudes, manners, habits that their parents have. They also show similar education levels, charitable levels, and even similar ways of interacting with authority figures. So all of those are similarities to their parents. While peers in the short term do have an influence, it's just not as long lasting. Peers can influence people to want to fit in, so they maybe will do certain things to try to fit in with a certain crowd. But peers can also influence how cooperation is learned, and then how socializing norms are learned within social groups. So the biggest thing to take away from here is your parents are going to have more of a long-term influence. Right now you might be saying, I never want to be like my parents, but I promise you when you get older, you're going to look back and be like, oh my God, I'm becoming my mom or my dad, because that's what I'm doing at this point. But your peers also have a short-term influence. I think my friends growing up and even now have had a huge impact on who I am, and will continue to have an impact on who I am as well. But my friends have changed. I don't hang out with the same people I did in high school or even in college. So they have a shorter influence than your parents and family. Okay, so we're going to stop this video. We'll come back with the third and last one, and we'll look at gender.